So we'll start off with Ethereum. Thanks, Zoom. So we'll start off with Ethereum. If you remember, Ethereum is a proof of work blockchain. It's similar to Bitcoin, which means that there's verifiable transactions, the ledger is immutable, and there's no double spending. One difference is that the block time on Ethereum is 15 seconds compared to 10 minutes on Bitcoin, which means, of course, that the chance of a miner finding an orphan block, or an uncle block as is known here, is much higher. Ethereum adjusts this by rewarding miners who find uncle blocks. And of course, if your transaction was included in an uncle block, it will be eligible to be mined again. Otherwise, you'll have a bunch of lost transactions, which is not good for user experience. Every entity on Ethereum has an account, which is identified by the address. So for users, that address is derived by the public key that you generate when you create a new account. If you want to send a transaction from that account, you just sign the transaction with the corresponding private key of that key pair. For smart contracts, it's a little bit different. The address is derived by the contract creator's address. So if you're creating a contract from an EOA or using the create opcode, it's that formula there. If you're using the create to opcode, it's a slightly different formula, which the details of which are not that important. Talking about smart contracts themselves, as the name would not imply at all, smart contracts are really just Turing-complete programs, which happen to run on the blockchain. And because they run on the blockchain, they get to natively manage their own financial assets. And also because they run on the blockchain, every computation that smart contract makes needs to be verified by every participant in the network. Otherwise, the participants won't be able to ensure that the claimed final state is the true final state. In order to prevent people from just performing a denial of service attack by performing very expensive computations, every computation you can do in a smart contract has an associated gas cost. This gas cost is just a measure of how complex it is. For something like addition, where the native CPU can perform it very quickly, the gas cost is low, about 3 gas. For something more complex, like checking the ether balance of an address, that needs to do storage loads and computations. So that's going to cost you about 400 gas. If you want to use a smart contract, you can call it from your EOA or another smart contract, but you will need to pay a fee. That fee is given by the gas price, which is how much ether you're willing to pay per unit gas multiplied by the number of gas you used. And another note is that smart contracts can't react to events by themselves. So you can't have a smart contract that waits for an event to occur and then automatically triggers. You need someone to trigger it manually. Of course, smart contracts can store data. This means they can persist things like the balance of a user. Otherwise, they would be kind of useless. And every transaction is sequential, which means that there's no multi-threading. You don't have to worry about concurrency issues, which eliminates a large subset of bugs. And of course, smart contracts run on top of the EVM. On the right there, you can see a disassembly of a smart contract. You can imagine that writing a whole program in this assembly language would be pretty stressful. And so fortunately, people have written higher level languages which compile down to the EVM assembly. One of these being Solidity. So Solidity is a programming language for the EVM. It was inspired by JavaScript, and it's one of the 2 mainstream languages in use today. The other one being Viper, which was inspired by Python. Unfortunately, Viper, or for better or for worse, I guess, Viper was designed with security in mind, which means that a lot of features that people have come to know and love aren't available, like recursion or unbounded loops. So Viper hasn't really caught on, and Solidity remains the most popular language among developers. Here's an example of a Solidity smart contract. We can see a private counter, which again, this data cannot be read by other smart contracts on the chain, but it can be read by users off chain. There's a function which increments the private counter and another function which transfers money from the current smart contract into whichever address the user specifies. A side note is that while in traditional programming, if you try to call a function that doesn't exist, your program will just crash. In Solidity, or in Ethereum, I guess, if you call a function that doesn't exist, the control will be handed to the fallback function, which is this function with no name. Sending ether to a contract with no data will also hit the fallback function. And I guess I'm going to be pausing occasionally just to get a drink here. So. Cool. With that review out of the way, now we can actually get to the good stuff. So we're going to start off with an obligatory, the DAO. This is possibly the most well-known hack on Ethereum, so we do have to talk about it. Now, DAO stands for a decentralized autonomous organization. What this basically means is that it's an organization that's governed by a smart contract. All the rules, all the things that you have to follow. They're basically set in stone. In a DAO, users can vote on things using the shares they own, again, according to the rules of the smart contract. In the case of the DAO, which is separate from DAO as an abstract concept, users can vote with votes they purchased during the ICO, which launched on April 30th, 2016, and raised approximately $150 million at the time. A little over a month later, an attacker exploited the DAO using a reentrancy vulnerability and drained a portion of the funds, that being approximately $50 million worth of Ether. Fortunately for the community, the funds were locked for 28 days per the rules. And so initially the community proposed a soft fork to block the funds. This soft fork would in essence prevent any instance of the DAO or a sub DAO from transferring Ether out. The attacker noticed this, and this part isn't really mentioned often in write-ups, and I thought it was hilarious, so I just had to include it. The attacker noticed this and published in an open letter where they claimed that they carefully examined the code of the DAO and decided to participate after finding the feature where splitting is rewarded with additional Ether. They made use of this feature and rightfully claimed 3.6 million Ether, and they would like to thank the DAO for this reward, which I thought was very funny. But you can imagine the community wasn't having any of this. They actually discovered that the soft fork originally proposed would introduce an additional DDoS vector because the soft fork would prevent transactions that cause the DAO to send Ether from being mined. However, the miner needs to have already processed the transaction in the first place. So you could cause a miner to perform expensive computations and then discard the result, which defeats the whole purpose of gas. So instead, the community proposed a new hard fork to recover the funds instead. This hard fork would take all of the Ether in every DAO and sub-DAO, transfer it into a new contract whose sole purpose was to refund owners of the DAO token at a rate of 100 DAO tokens to 1 Ether. Although the vote for this hard fork was it passed with a supermajority, it still caused a schism, and this is what resulted in Ethereum Classic. Backstory aside, I mentioned earlier that the DAO was vulnerable to a reentrancy bug, but what exactly is reentrancy? Well, as the name would suggest, reentrancy occurs when a function reenters itself during execution. For example, function A calls function A. However, it can also occur indirectly. For example, function A calls function B, which then calls function A again. Now, typically, this setup isn't a big deal in traditional programming because you're programming in a non-adversarial environment. This means that if you write a program and you have a reentrancy and then your program breaks, you can just not do that and you'll be fine. However, it's a very big deal in an adversarial environment, such as the blockchain, where there's millions of dollars at stake and everyone's trying to get at it. The problem is that reentrancy interrupts function execution during an intermediate state where the outcome is unknown. This means that when you execute your function again, you result in undefined behavior. Sometimes it's fine. Sometimes the undefined behavior turns out to be benign, but sometimes it blows up in your face, like in the case of the DAO. Here's a very simple example of what went wrong with the DAO. We have a contract here which maintains a mapping of balances for each user, and we have a function which allows a user to withdraw some Ether from the contract, assuming they have enough balance to do so. So we can see that we first check that there's sufficient balance for the user. If there isn't, then we revert with a message saying they're withdrawing too much. If they do have the balance, then we will send the Ether to them and then update the mapping so they can't withdraw again. At first glance, this code might seem perfectly fine. The problem is that the line where the Ether is transferred out to the user, where it says message.sender.call, this line actually transfers control flow to the caller. And the caller at that point may choose to call withdraw again. You'll notice that if this happens, we haven't updated the balance mapping yet. This means that as far as the smart contract is concerned, the user still has enough balance to withdraw a second time. The attacker then can perform this recursive attack indefinitely until they've drained the entire contract of all the funds, even though they probably weren't allocated all the funds to begin with. The common suggestion to fix reentrancy is to apply the check effect interact pattern, which, as the name suggests, says that you should first perform all the checks you need to perform, which ensure the state is correct, then perform all the effects you need to perform, which modify the state, and finally perform interactions, which is what makes all the external calls to other contracts or the caller. And this pattern is a very roundabout way of ensuring that basically if you do have a reentrancy opportunity in your contract, it's still not a vulnerability because by the time the reentrancy occurs, you've already finalized your state. And so there's no possible way to get into an undefined behavior situation. Looking at our previous example, we can see that if we move the effect above the interaction, thereby following the check effect interaction pattern, this contract is now no longer vulnerable to reentrancy. However, one thing to know is that check effect interact doesn't always apply. And ultimately, it's up to the developer to be aware of how their contract might behave under different circumstances. For example, considering after external call, what checks have already been passed, or consider what state hasn't been modified yet. To give you an example of something that the check effect interact pattern doesn't hold, we can see in this example, this contract allows a user to deposit some number of tokens. Now, unfortunately, some tokens don't follow the ERC20 specification and will actually credit the recipient with less tokens that was initially transferred. So this contract tries to get around that by measuring the balance of tokens before and after the transfer, and then crediting the users with the difference. You can see that by necessity, the effect must occur after the interaction. So in this case, the smart contract developer would have to be aware of how the contract might behave under different circumstances instead of just relying on the check effect interact pattern. So moving on to our next exhibit is the parity multisig. Now, a multisig wallet is basically a smart contract which acts like a wallet, with one exception being that multiple people are required to authorize a single transaction. If you've ever turned on 2FA on Google or any other service, this is the same sort of thought process where if you're doing something really dangerous, you should probably get multiple approvals before that action is allowed to proceed. Now, back in 2017, a really popular multisig was written by Parity Technologies, which is used by a large number of people. So it was very unfortunate then that on July 18th, 2017, about $32 million was stolen by a single attacker from 3 different Parity multisig wallets. Fortunately, the community noticed this and quickly rescued over $160 million in additional vulnerable funds from over 500 wallets. Now, what happened was that the attacker was able to hijack the ownership of the wallets themselves. And as you can imagine, once you're the owner of a wallet, it's very trivial to transfer the assets out. So really the question is, how did the attacker manage to take over the wallets in the first place? And the answer is that Parity misused the delegate call feature. So what is delegate call? Well, if you recall that accounts on Ethereum are identified by the address, this means that it's very convenient to authenticate callers based on the address. For example, you'll see very often checks such as if message.sender is equal to some known address, then that message sender must be the owner. So then the question becomes, how can you delegate one smart contract's authority, i.e. their address, to another smart contract? The answer is the delegate call instruction, which says, given the current smart contract, execute the code of another smart contract in the current context. For example, if we say A delegate calls to B, we mean that pretend A has the same source code as B, but still maintain A storage, address balance, and other attributes. This is obviously very powerful for developers, but as with all powerful tools, it needs to be used very carefully, or else things, again, might blow up in your face. Just to give you a visual example of what's happening, here we can see contract A is performing a delegate call to B. And although contract B is setting a variable to 5, delegate call ensures that the context of the call remains with A. And so, in fact, we've updated the storage for contract A instead of contract B. Anyways, why would you want to use delegate call in the first place? One thing you might do with it is to save money. Now, considering a multi-sig wallet, each user should probably get their own wallet. Otherwise, they'll be sharing an address, and that makes it very hard for other smart contracts to authenticate them. But deploying a smart contract is expensive because for every byte of the smart contract you need to write on chain, you have to pay some ether to do so. And so one solution might be to extract the logic of the multisig, the really bulky part of it, and only deploy it once. Then when a user wants to create a new multisig wallet, they can deploy a very small contract called a proxy, and this small contract just delegate calls into the implementation. This is known as the smart contract proxy pattern. So looking at the parity multisig, we can see that in the proxy contract, during the construction of the contract, it immediately delegate calls into the library and calls the init wallet function. The init wallet function simply initializes the daily limit and the owners. Now, if we look back to the proxy contract, we'll notice that there's only one other function that is of relevance, which is the fallback function. If you recall, the fallback function is only called when a function is called which is unmatched in the current contract, which means that no matter what we call the proxy with, it will be delegated to the wallet library. Now, what the attacker did was very simple. They just called the proxy contract with the init wallet function. Because the init wallet function wasn't defined in the proxy, it was delegated to the implementation, which reinitialized the wallet and hijacked ownership. So the solution here is really simple. Simply don't allow reinitialization of proxy contracts. And today, this is made very simple for you through the Open Zeppelin smart contract library, which is a set of contracts that have been battle tested and audited and is generally considered to be secure. This is a snippet from that library. This is an initializer modifier, which ensures that if this modifier is applied to a function, that function can only be called once on initialization and no more. Cool. So moving on to Bancor. Bancor is an early automated market maker that predates Uniswap. And it follows some of the same principles, which means that for every pair, there's one converter. However, while Uniswap is marketed as decentralized and is decentralized, Bancor is marketed as decentralized, but wasn't quite actually decentralized. For example, the owner of every converter had some very powerful permissions, like being able to set a whitelist for who could perform a swap, being able to configure fees, and most importantly, managing the reserves of the converter itself. You can probably imagine where this is going, because on July 9th, 2018, about $23 million of Ether, NPXS, and Bancor tokens was stolen. And the way it was stolen was that the attackers actually used Bancor's own wallet, their Bancor Deployer 2 address, to withdraw all the funds from a few converters and transfer it to their own address. Fortunately, Bancor was able to recover the BNT tokens, but not the ETH, because Bancor in their own token had built in a feature which allowed them to freeze tokens on any address. Now, what this incident showed us was that for DeFi protocols, secret management is just as important as smart contract security, especially if your protocol is not fully decentralized. So, if you're running a very small protocol, or if you're just a user, you might consider using a hardware wallet. While if you've got billions of dollars of TVL, of total value locked, you might consider using custodian or multi-sig instead. But it also raises the question of how much decentralization do you actually need? And one thing to keep in mind is that decentralization isn't the be-all and end-all. And sometimes it might be useful to maintain control for risk mitigation purposes. I can tell you from personal experience that there's been plenty of times when I've reported issues to various protocols, and they just had to sit there, sit on their hands for hours or days, hoping no one would exploit the vulnerability, because they didn't have a way to pause the protocol. So, for a low level of control, being able to pause depositing or ways of entering the protocol to keep new users safe might be something to consider. And on the other end of the spectrum, being able to blacklist users or freeze funds entirely might be justifiable depending on what protocol you're writing. Oh man, back to parity. Okay, so we're not done with parity yet. Remember when they patched their wallet to prevent ownership hijacking? They added this only uninitialized modifier, which ensures that the init wallet function can't be called on an initialized wallet. And they deployed this new implementation on July 20th. Then a couple months later, a user named DevOps199, who has since deleted their GitHub account, so it just shows up as Ghost instead, they posted on GitHub that they accidentally killed the contract. And because of this, every single parity multisig wallet using this new implementation was essentially locked forever, which means that about 500,000 ETH has basically been burned. Now, what happened was that Parity forgot to initialize the implementation contract, and no one really noticed because the proxies were working fine. They worked perfectly. And DevOps199, in the process of, we'll call it performing security research, decided to initialize the implementation for themselves and then promptly self-destructed it. And the self-destruct operation basically deletes all the code of the contract, deletes all the storage, and sends the Ether to a new address. And as you can imagine, with no code to execute, all of the proxies basically became no-ops. So through these two incidents, Parity paid a lot of money to teach us some very important lessons about how to use the proxy pattern. For example, always making sure that the implementation contract is secured, never implementing self-destruct unless it's absolutely necessary. And even then, are you really sure about that? And of course, from the first incident, remembering that every function in the implementation is callable at any time. And so, make sure that you've considered the implications of that. For example, don't allow reinitialization of your proxy contracts. Okay, moving on to a really fun one. This is a project called FOMO 3D, and it's possibly the most transparent pyramid scheme you've ever heard of. The way it worked was very simple. You pay a small fee to click a button. Every time anyone clicks a button, an extra 180 seconds was added onto the timer. The timer starts at 24 hours, and when the timer hits 0, whoever was the last person gets basically all of the fees that everyone else paid to click the button. There are some other gameplay mechanics to spice things up, but that's about the core of it. And at its peak, there was about 10,000 Ether in the FOMO 3D contract in the pot. So, as an enterprising Ethereum user, you might be wondering, how do you make sure you're the last person to click that button and get that pot? What if you make it so that no one else can click the button? That seems like a good idea. But how exactly do you prevent an entire blockchain from processing any transactions when the whole point of the blockchain is to be decentralized and open to all? You can't exactly bribe all of the miners, right? There's always going to be some miner out there that you can't get in contact with. Or can you? Well, if we think about it, miners order transactions based on gas price. This is just the economically correct choice to do. And every block has a gas limit, which is intended to prevent miners from creating a huge block that no one else can validate, which means that the total amount of gas spent by all transactions in a block can't exceed the block gas limit itself. So maybe you can legally bribe miners by simply bidding up the gas price and just using up all the gas in the block. Well, apparently this wasn't too far-fetched of an idea because that's exactly what one user did. In this transaction, you can see they set a gas limit of 4.8 million gas, which was approximately half the block gas limit at the time. And they paid, again, at the time, a very high gas price of 14 Gwei, even though now it's like 200. And they used up in a single transaction, like half the block gas space. And they did this for an entire block, for like 11 blocks, until they finally claimed the pot of, again, around 10,000 Ether. And this incident was really interesting because prior to this, everyone sort of talked about the risks of game theory, where it's like, well, if your stakes were like really high, then maybe someone would come along and do something like this where you didn't quite expect it, but no one had actually seen it happen. And this sort of proved that, yeah, people will do this if the stakes are high enough. So, assumptions about chain liveness, whether or not the chain will actually process your transactions may not hold under very high stakes. Another very common idea is to use the block hash for a source of randomness. And again, if the stakes are high enough, maybe a miner will choose to keep mining a block until they generate a block hash that happens to win the game. Okay, next up on our list we have is BZX. Now, BZX is a decentralized lending platform. This means that users can deposit assets, and then users can borrow assets using the assets they previously deposited as collateral. And of course, to do this, you sort of need to know the price of the asset that you're using as collateral. And BZX does this using a price oracle. In this case, they used Kyber. Now, Kyber is, to put it very simply, a AMM aggregator. It basically, for each pair of assets, it aggregates a bunch of AMMs and then finds you the best price across all of them. To simplify the problem, we're only going to pretend like there's only one AMM in question. In this case, we're going to pretend it's Uniswap, which means that if we want to use Kyber to check the price of an asset, we're essentially checking the price of the asset on Uniswap. Oh, sorry about that. Now, the problem here is that, of course, the spot price on Uniswap can be changed very easily. It can also be changed extremely dramatically if you have enough capital. And that's just the way that Uniswap works. Like every time you buy something, you're changing the price. But of course, not everyone has 50,000 Ether laying around. So if you don't have enough capital, just get a flash loan. And in fact, that's what someone did. So on February 18th, 2020, BZX suffered what was probably the first attack against the DeFi protocol using flash loans. They also suffered what was possibly the second attack against the DeFi project using flash loans, but we're not going to talk about that one because it's not as relevant to this topic. So let's talk about the first one. This is what the attacker did. Very briefly, they borrowed a bunch of Ether. They bought a bunch of SUSD, this stablecoin, from Kyber using some of the Ether. This drove the price of SUSD way up because they bought up basically all of the supply. Then they bought some more SUSD from synthetics at normal market prices, and they deposited all of that onto BZX as collateral. BZX looked at it and went, holy shit, this is really expensive. So here's a lot of Ether for your collateral. And in essence, they took out an under collateralized loan and they got 2.3K ETH off of it. And so the lesson that we learned from that, and we're still learning to this day, is that you should never use the spot price of really any AMM as a price oracle, because by definition, the spot price is easily manipulated. Instead, if you're using something on Uniswap, V2, or V3, you might want to use something like the TWAP price instead. As the name suggests, it's the average price over a period of time. So, if you want more resistance to manipulation, you can choose a longer time period. Of course, this means that your price won't change, won't react as quickly to volatile prices. So maybe you want a shorter time period instead, but of course that makes it more vulnerable to manipulation. And so ultimately it is still up to you to decide exactly how long the period you want that TWAP price to be. All right, next up is the 0x exchange. So the 0x exchange is a large decentralized exchange where users can make or place orders. It's not an AMM, it's more of like an order book. And it supports different types of signatures to allow different entities to make trades. For example, if you with your EOA want to make a trade, you can use the ETH sign signature. If you have a smart contract that wants to make a trade, they can use the wallet signature. Now, if we look at the wallet signature itself, we'll see that it makes use of some low-level assembly. Specifically, it's making a static call to the wallet address, and it's checking that one, the call itself didn't revert, and two, the call returned a truthy value, aka anything that's non-zero. Now, although this code seems correct at first glance, it actually has two major issues which combined cause this serious vulnerability. The first one is that this code isn't aware of the fact that when you make a call to an address that has no code, it's equivalent to making a call to an address that has a single byte of opcode, the stop opcode, which means that the call will always succeed. That means that if you perform a call to any EOA, which has no code, that call is guaranteed to succeed. The second mistake that was made here is that you can see that the static call opcode is told to write the output to CD start. It's supposed to overwrite the output with 32 bytes of whatever is returned. This was done for optimization purposes because memory allocation on Ethereum, again, costs gas. However, what the authors didn't realize is that the call family of opcodes, so for example, call, delegate call, static call, call code, these opcodes don't zero the output space. These opcodes don't zero the output space of the memory being written to. This means that if the smart contract returned no data, then the output area would be untouched. In this case, the output area is the same as the input area, which we know is non-zero because we just called the smart contract with some data. Putting these two issues together, this basically means that any EOA can be, 0x can be tricked into considering 0x04, the byte string 0x04, as a valid signature for any EOA because they will always pass this wallet signature check. Obviously, this is very non-ideal, and the damage put essentially every user of 0x at risk. Fortunately, the bug was patched before users could be exploited, but this incident did teach us that, to write a smart contract securely on Ethereum, you need to be aware of the various quirks for the EVM. If you're dealing with low-level assembly, then of course, knowing that the call family of opcodes don't zero out memory is very important, but you don't necessarily have to be working with low-level assembly in order to run into these problems. For example, the block hash function, which takes in a number and returns the block hash of that block number, doesn't work for blocks older than 256 blocks. And you either know about that or you find out after your smart contract has the vulnerability in it. Another example is that the easy recover function, which is meant to allow you to determine which public key signed a message, returns 0 if it fails instead of reverting. And I mentioned earlier that the fallback function will be called if your smart contract receives some ether, but it turns out there's ways to send ether to a smart contract without triggering the fallback function. So all of these things, if you weren't aware of it, could introduce vulnerabilities into your contract. And yeah. Okay, we're going to move on to Black Thursday, and I'm going to speed up a bit because I have a few more to get through. Okay, so Black Thursday refers to March 12th, 2020, when there was broad price instability across basically all crypto assets. And this, of course, included Ethereum, which is a crypto asset. Over the course of several hours, it dropped from a price of $200 down to $100 before recovering to $150. And because such a vast majority of DeFi is lending platforms and other protocols of the like, this triggered a chain reaction across basically all of DeFi. But possibly the hardest hit was MakerDAO. A quick aside, MakerDAO, for those who aren't familiar, is the protocol that manages the DAI stablecoin, which is the largest US dollar stablecoin on the blockchain. Basically, users lock up collateral, in this case, Ether, to mint DAI, and then a trusted set of EOAs will push price updates of the current US dollar value of Ether on chain. So that's MakerDAO. But back to Black Thursday. So when the price dropped, obviously that triggered mass liquidations, because your position that was collateralized by Ether suddenly was no longer collateralized when Ether halved in price. Now, liquidation bots, so automatic programs that try to capture these liquidation opportunities to make money, quickly noticed this and started driving up the gas price to bid on these liquidation auctions. This increase in gas price meant that it was harder for these price oracles to push updates on chain, like Maker's Oracle we talked about earlier. And this sort of snowballed on and on until there was just crazy chain congestion everywhere between all the bots trying to bid on liquidation auctions, all the bots trying to push price updates, and users just trying to make sure their position was safe. Now, of course, Maker, as a protocol which accepts collateral, was also affected by this. Specifically, all the Ether locked up in the protocol was no longer collateralizing all the DAI that was minted. So the Maker protocol automatically auctioned off all of the ETH that was under collateralized in order to repay all the DAI debt. Now, normally what's supposed to happen here is that these keepers, as they call, are supposed to bid on these auctions for roughly the correct value of Ether. Sorry, for roughly the collect dollar value of the Ether being auctioned. So, if the batch of 50 Ether is being auctioned at a price of 100, you would expect the keepers to auction roughly $5,000 of DAI. However, there were some issues, caused by Black Thursday, one of them being the network congestion we talked about, and the other issue being just that there wasn't enough DAI liquidity on the market to actually bid on these auctions. All of the other users were buying them up to manage their own positions. And because MakerDAO never really expected this situation to occur, they never implemented a floor on their auction, which means that a few users noticed that they could just bid approximately 0 DAI for each auction and get away with it because no one else was able to bid anything higher. And this ultimately resulted in a loss of approximately $8 billion US for Maker users. And what this showed us is that, under very extreme conditions, there's a lot of assumptions that we make which might not hold up anymore. For example, DAI is the biggest stablecoin, therefore there should always be liquidity for a DAI to do stuff with. Or, if I send a transaction with high enough gas price, then that would definitely be mined in the next block or two. And we saw that, under extreme conditions, these just aren't true anymore. Okay, here's a really fun one. This is a gambling app called Ethereal. And the way it works is very simple. You basically roll a 100-sided dice and you try to bet what number you'll roll under. So, you can bet that you'll roll under 51. And if the die rolls under 51, then you'll basically win back your deposit and then some. The way Ethereal works is that it uses Oracleized, now known as Provable, to generate a random number from random.org. And because, again, the blockchain can't interact with the outside world, this is a two-step process. In the first step, you submit your bet along with what you want to bet under. And in the second step, the Oracleized EOAs call the Ethereal contract with the result and the contract will pay you out if you win. Now, ignoring the fact that Oracleize could steal all the money if they were evil, it seems like this process is pretty secure. But there actually turned out to be a very fatal flaw in this. And to see what it is, we should consider what happens if the bet is orphaned. As we mentioned earlier, the orphan rate on Ethereum is much higher than Bitcoin because of the shorter block time, which means that it's much more likely for a transaction to be orphaned. And when it is, it's eligible to be remined in the next block. But what happens if the bet and the response were both orphaned? Well, now you have two valid transactions. One of them is the bet, and one of them is the outcome of the bet. And it's signed, which means that you can replay it. So putting all these together, what you can do is you can wait for a bet and response to be orphaned, throw away the bet because you don't need it, but place your own bet instead and hope that you get the same bet ID. When you do, you submit the orphan response, which contains the result you already know. And if both these transactions make it on chain, you've essentially placed the bet that you knew the outcome to, which is a guaranteed win. So this incident was really interesting because this is possibly the first and only attack that used orphan transactions as the vulnerability. And it taught us that we should always ensure that any callbacks we make from off-chain should be tied to the original requester and not necessarily some sequential value like an ID. Or in general, if you're making transactions from an off-chain service, you should make sure that that transaction is safe to be sent no matter which order it arrives at, no matter who's sending it at what time. Okay, two more left. This one's quick. This is a this is a project called Degen Money. It was a yield farm that was launched during the hype of yield farms. Yield farms are basically very quickly, you deposit some assets and you keep it locked up in there, and to reward you for locking up your collateral, you'll get some other tokens in return, which you can dump on the market, something like that. Degen Money was special because anyone who used it would be prompted for two transactions. The first one requested approval for the smart contract to spend your assets, which is totally fine. That's how all of these protocols work, is they need approval to spend your assets. But the second one requested permission for the attacker to spend your assets. And after you use Ethereum for a couple of years, you just sort of like click the approve button as you need to see it. And so a couple of weeks after launch, the attacker literally just took all the money they were authorized to take from all of the users of Degen Money and just walked away with it. Okay, last one. This is a project called Pickle Finance. And and Pickle Finance is an on-chain yield aggregator. This basically means that you can take your assets, and instead of having to figure out where to put these assets yourself to maximize yield, you just give it to Pickle Finance, and they will do all the steps of finding the best opportunity and depositing it and managing it and withdrawing it. And you just sit back and relax. This is obviously ideal for you because it reduces the number of steps you need to take, but also it means that you don't have to pay the gas prices yourself. All of the gas costs are socialized. Which makes it very unfortunate that on November 21st, 2020, Pickle Finance was hacked for approximately $20 million US. Now, this hack wasn't notable for the amount, which, while high, wasn't the highest we've seen, but more the attack itself, which is quite possibly the most technically sophisticated hack that DeFi has ever seen. And to give you an idea of how technically sophisticated it is, here's a flowchart made by a community member, which shows you just how many steps went into this attack. And I want to draw your attention to three steps in particular. Number one and number two shows the attacker deploying these fake underlying and evil jar contracts, which we'll get to later. And then step number four shows the attacker performing a delegate call to the curve proxy logic with some forged data. Now, we already know what delegate call does, so you might be wondering what exactly was curve proxy logic doing that made this whole attack possible. Now, if we take a look at the function itself, we can see that this is a function meant to add liquidity to a Curve smart contract, Curve being another popular AMM. What's interesting about this function is that basically every parameter is user controlled. For example, the 5 parameters we see up top, curve function signature, pool size, underlying index, and underlying, these are all user controlled. And we can see that this function at the very end makes a call to the curve address with some call data. The call data is composed using the function signature, which we control, The liquidity, which is an array constructed with data we control, and the zero integer. The array itself consists of the underlying amount, which is fetched from a contract that we control. Basically, this contract allowed you to make any arbitrary call you wanted from the controller, although it was a bit obfuscated. And so what the attacker did was they caused the controller to make a call to this Pickle Finance contract called a jar. To the contract, which basically stored the asset itself, told it to withdraw all the assets, and then transferred it to the attacker through this contract that was ostensibly meant to add liquidity to curve instead. It also popularized the idea of these evil contracts, which, as we saw earlier, the attacker deployed two. One was the evil underlying, and the other one was the evil jar. These evil contracts are basically contracts that meet the interface definition for some contract, but does something wildly different. And so, in traditional programming, we have this concept called duck typing, which says that if it walks like a duck, it swims like a duck, and quacks like a duck, it might be a duck. But on Ethereum, it might just be a smart contract trying to exploit your DeFi protocol. Oh, and finally, what the Pickle Finance incident showed us is that complexity breeds insecurity. And if you have some really complex code that's meant to be very smart, like a contract that's meant to deposit things on Curve, but it's meant to handle all of these different cases, so everything is user specified. Well, that's really hard to secure, and you might just get it wrong. So you should really just follow the KISS principle. Just keep it simple, stupid. So to wrap up with some conclusions, so I've sort of given you this really bleak presentation of all these hacks that happened over the years. What I didn't really go into was, all the times that the hacks didn't happen, whether the hack was prevented because someone reported it responsibly after the project was launched, whether the hack was found during an audit, or maybe it was found by the developers themselves as if they were writing the code. And these prevented hacks are mostly driven by, advances in cooling or, advances in research in the space that the community as a whole is progressing. And so I think in the future, tooling and research will really be pivotal to keeping DeFi secure. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to Dr. Arthur Gervais, who's going to talk more about that, I guess.
Thanks a lot, Sam. This was a really extensive overview. It was excellent. So let me quickly share my iPad screen. Okay, good. Can everybody see my screen?
Yes.
Perfect. So I'll be trying to speak about three main topics today. These are flash loan attacks. So it will be somewhat redundant to what Sam already said. I will be trying to go a little bit further. Then we'll be speaking about blockchain extractable value as well as sandwich attacks. So let's start with flash loans for fun and profit, as we like to say in the security scene. So now let's assume we have here two participants. So this is Bart and Bob. So Bob is a bit a younger guy. He doesn't have access to too much capital, but he really likes to do music. And in order to buy this turntable to produce new music, well, what could he do if he doesn't have capital to actually fund this expensive tool? Well, he could get a credit from Bart, who has access to some more capital. So what could go wrong if you get a loan? Well, what could go wrong is that you're not able to pay back the loan when by the time that you should pay it back, which is typically referred as defaulting on a debt. So this brings us to the fundamental question: is there any way where Bart can grant a loan to Bob without the risk of Bob actually defaulting on the debt? And this is the idea of a flash loan that Sam already introduced. So you have this pot of money here. So you take a flash loan out of this pot of money, and you call a function, go wild with this loan. You can do whatever you like. But then you have a third condition, which is to repay that loan plus some additional interest. And if you don't meet this condition here, then the entire loan will be basically be discarded. Right. So all of these 3 steps here is happening in a single atomic transaction. And either they happen atomically or they don't affect the Ethereum state. So if the transaction is reverted, the Ethereum state is not modified. So if you look at it from a slightly more technical view, you can think of it as you can think of a flash loan as you are having a smart contract pool, right, where users can deposit assets. So for example, here Alice can deposit some asset X by adding liquidity. And then you have another user here who can take out a loan, but has to repay that loan plus an interest paid to Alice. So all within a single atomic transaction. Now, the cool thing is, because this is a fairly simple liquidity pool, most exchanges that we know and lending platforms add this functionality to their contract because it can offer additional interest to their liquidity providers. If you look at the flash loan pool sizes, so you have various different available pools, and obviously you can also deploy your private or custom flash loan pools. But as far as I've seen, Uniswap is kind of the biggest flash loan pool with almost $2 billion US. I think these numbers obviously they vary quite widely over time. But what's interesting is that there's a certain fee that's being charged here, and DYDX is apparently the cheapest. They only require one way, which is also a constant, so it doesn't depend on the size of the flash loan that you take. However, from a usability perspective, it's much easier to take a flash loan on Aave or Uniswap because these are well documented for beginners at least. So why flash loans? Where are these actually useful? So if we look at the past history, we can just differentiate which flash loans are taken according to the token price, and we can see that so DAI seems to be the most popular asset that's being lent out. So we looked between January and October 2020. So you can see here, this is the accumulative US dollar amount that was taken out in terms of flash loans for the DAI coin. And then you can see here there are many other tokens. So what we've also seen is that flash loans typically touch several DeFi platforms at once. So we will discuss the use cases and why that is the case. But they also consume a significant amount of the Ethereum gas limit. I think on average, most flash loans consume between 5 to 10% actually of the block limit. So this means about between 1 to 1.5 million gas. So what about the use cases? Well, risk-free arbitrage seems to be the most prevalent use case of flash loans. So arbitrage is the process of buying and selling an asset at different markets at different prices and profiting from the price difference. Now I'm saying risk-free. This is obviously there's always a risk in trading, but it's kind of risk-free because you can add a condition to your arbitrage that if one of the swaps is not successful, then the entire transaction fails. So if you don't get the price that you anticipated to get, because maybe you were front run or the price changed intermittently, then this arbitrage transaction can fail gracefully. So the problem is if your transaction fails, you are still liable to pay the gas price, or you paid it up front, technically speaking, before even executing. So therefore, you can't really consider it risk-free. But it's still, flash loans do, they minimize the collateral value that you're required to perform an arbitrage. And therefore they reduce the risk for arbitrage together with the atomic transaction execution property. Flash loans can also be used to manipulate price oracles, as Sam said. They can help you to pump and dump instantly like a particular market, which can be prevented with time-weighted average price oracles, as Sam outlined beautifully. Flash loans can be used for wash trading. So wash trading is the process of buying and selling an asset without the actual intent to hold that asset. It's just to inflate the trading volume, to send a wrong signal to the market, to the other market participants. And you can also do flash minting. This is basically the process of if for example you could create a coin, you can create a token that has a fixed supply, but you enable the option to mint as many tokens as you'd like in a single atomic transaction, with the condition that those tokens have to be burned by the end of the transaction. So in fact, you can't increase the token supply indefinitely, but just virtually within a single transaction. I'm sure you've seen in Sam's presentation, there were a lot of DeFi attacks in general, where especially in 2020, also recently in 2021. So flash loans were often involved as a tool, but they're not the cause. So when I'm speaking about flash loan attacks, I don't actually mean that flash loans are a bad thing. They're just a tool to help identify issues in the intertwined DeFi platforms, and they beautifully lower the capital requirements such that they democratize access to those to exploiting these vulnerabilities. So it's kind of an enabler to finding problems that are present and that will be found eventually, but they significantly lower the cost, which is great for security, right? We want to fix issues rather than have security by obscurity. So just on a very high level, this is really an arbitrage example that we took on chain. There are many more that you can find on chain as well. So in the first step, this is the flash loan provider, DYDX. We take a flash loan, for example, 2 million USDC. We exchange those on the Curve Y market, and the resulting DAI is then exchanged on the Curve SUSD market, and we proceed to repay the loan. So the Curve Y and Curve SUSD market in this particular example had a different price, which you could exploit through an arbitrage, resulting in this particular example with a profit of about 16K. So the beauty is here that anybody can really execute this arbitrage by simply paying the transaction fees and without having access to 2 million USDC upfront, right? So there's no need for this capital requirement. The 4 steps here, so 1, 2, 3, 4, are all executed within an atomic transaction. That means, for example, if step 4 is not successful, if it's for some reason fails, then step 3, 2, and 1 will be reverted, so they won't be written to the blockchain state, will not be changed. All right, so let's dive a bit into flash loan attacks. So what can go wrong if you give an adversary billions of US dollar and atomic transactions? There's as Sam already mentioned, there's BZX that got attacked in February 2020. There are actually 2 attacks. So this is the first one. I won't go into the details of this one. We will go more into the details of the second one. But just to give you like a high level view of how this works. So you have here a flash loan transaction, right, which touches on several points, right? So there's a flash loan provider. We interact with Compound, BZX, Uniswap twice, and at the end we pay back the flash loan. And there's a second stage of this attack where the adversary repays the debt to redeem Ether. But the only message I really want to give you here is that the input, so the gas price that needed to be paid upfront by the user was $130. The output, the ultimate output that the adversary got was about $350,000. And we found that with our optimization framework that I will discuss in a bit, the optimal parameters at this particular blockchain state would have yielded $830. So when I mean optimal parameters, what I mean technically is those numbers here. Right? So the path basically is given. So you know that you have to take a flash loan. You know that you have to go to compound. You know that you have to then go to BZX. But basically those parameters here, where you have to choose how much am I going to put into this particular stage of the path of this attack vector. These are the parameters of the attack. If you optimize them, then you ultimately get almost double the revenue than the adversary got here in this particular example. So let's look at the BZX Oracle manipulation in February 2020. So we have here an adversary, and this adversary, as Sam actually explained, he got 7,500 Ether as a flash loan from BZX. So with this Ether, or parts of this Ether at least, right, he goes to Uniswap and he provides, or he sells 540 Ether in exchange for about 90K as US dollar. And the Ether market at this particular point in time was rather small compared to the amount to the trade, right? So there were 880 Ether in there. After this trade, there are about 1,400 Ether in there. And obviously, if you perform such a large trade relative to the liquidity pool size of the AMM, then the price will decline from about 170 as US dollar to 106 as US dollar. So you could call this a price dump. Then the second step would be to take 360 Ether, and you do the similar operation on the Kyber reserve. There was actually very little Ether in there prior to this prior to the swap, and here as well the US dollar price will be reduced significantly. Then in the fourth step, we go to synthetics. So we deposit about 3,500 Ether, and we get near close to $1 million as US dollar back from synthetics. And finally, we go to BZX, or the adversary goes to BZX, where he collateralizes roughly 1.1 million as US dollar in exchange for 6,800 Ether. So how does he get so much Ether in this particular step? And this is what Sam already explained in a bit different way, but it's the same message, right? So BZX here is using Uniswap and the Kyber reserve as price oracles to determine the exchange rate between US dollar and Ether. And because we previously reduced the exchange rate significantly here and here, right, we are able to receive that much Ether in this particular call. So in the end, the adversary pays back the flash loan to BZX just to make sure that the repayment is done properly, and that the flash loan contract is happy and doesn't revert anything. And the adversary ends up with about 2.3K Ether, as Sam mentioned. Great. So how can we optimize such attacks? So let's say we have a given path, right? We know that we can get, for example, 2.3K Ether. How can we be sure that this is the optimal amounts that we want to extract from this particular blockchain state that we're looking at? So what we can do is we can formulate DeFi actions into models. So we all know that a constant product AMM could be expressed as such, right? I mean, we know the basic formula X times Y is K for a constant product formula like Uniswap. And we can then construct a constrained optimization problem based on the attack vector that we know. We show this in the next slide. So the objective is really to maximize the outcome profit, right? This is we have a clear objective. This is objectively measurable. So what we then do is to fetch the on-chain state that the attack is expected to be executed on. So you can do this by having, for example, an archive node and fetching a particular state of the past blockchain. So on a high level, we really take, like, we have DeFi models, we have the given attack vector. So we have not, I mean, I assume here that you have some way of finding this particular attack vector. We actually have a paper on how to find these attack vectors in an automated way, in a nearly real-time automated way, which I won't go much further into, but I think I referenced it in the lecture notes. So once you have the attack vector, you fetch the DeFi on-chain state, you resolve the optimal parameters, and then you perform a concrete execution on the particular blockchain state that you're testing to validate your hypothesis. So how would this look like concretely on the B6 attack 2 that we just looked at and that Sam also outlined? Well, in the first case, we know we borrow X Ether from the B6 flash loan, right? And then we have kind of three conversions where we have to determine our parameters. Oh, excuse me. Then we have three parameters. So P1, P2, P3, right? These are kind of conversions that we perform between ETH and US dollar. And these three conversions happen on three different venues. As such, we might have three different functions that tell us how what's the return, right? So we need models for these different exchanges that give us accurate numbers, quantify numbers of what we can expect in return, depending on the parameters that we pass to this exchange. So the fifth step is to collateralize SUSD and to borrow Ether, right? This was on the B6 platform, which is using as a price oracle Uniswap and Kyber, right? So we can rewrite this as Z being the sum of these different functions given the parameters that we don't know yet about, right? So we want to find these parameters P1, P2, P3. Obviously, there's a last condition. We always have to repay X Ether back to the flash loan provider. So the objective that we want to solve is here. It's quite clear. Is the following, such that P1, P2, P3 is smaller or equal than X in this particular example. So we can't have more than X because this is the amount of Ether that we are lending out from the flash loan pool. So if we solve this, or I mean, you can basically encode this quite simply in SciPy. So we used SLSQP on a relative standard Ubuntu machine, and we then validated the parameters that we found through a concrete execution on the real blockchain state. So I invite you to check out the full details in our paper, which really outlines kind of the core of this particular attack. And then you will see that the second attack, where we were able to boost basically the revenue of the adversary by a factor of 1.73 roughly, while the first attack was possible to be boosted by a factor of 2.37. Okay, any questions so far? Perfect. Okay, let me jump into the remaining topics. So I briefly touched on blockchain extractable value. So just to give you another high level overview. So you have a blockchain, right? So this is the full blockchain stack. And DeFi is, in a sense, here this beautiful complex construct of financial services with, I like to emphasize, atomic composability, right? Which enables then flash loans and other funny instruments. So you do have market mechanisms such as liquidations that Sam also touched upon. So if the price of an asset drops, then the collateral value might not be sufficient anymore to represent the debt, and therefore liquidation may be triggered. So this is particularly important for lending and borrowing protocols, as well as stable coins and other protocols in DeFi. So to explain blockchain extractable value, I would just give like a concrete example. There are many other examples, but just for the sake of simplicity, I'll focus on the slides here on liquidations. So if the price of a collateral drops below a health factor, then you trigger liquidation. And then the question is, who will liquidate? So do you have any idea who might possibly liquidate? So it could be, let's say, it could be some, in quotes, adversary trader. It could be the one who actually has the, who opened the loan in the first place, or it could be some miner. Now, it's a bit, I'm a bit biased, or let's say, there's no right or wrong here, right? We're just playing according to the rules of the smart contract. So the fact that I'm put here an adversary doesn't really mean that this is an adversary action. Just for the sake of illustration here, I want to emphasize that there are different actors that might be able to liquidate this particular loan. So and multiple actors may do so. The ultimate decision power remains with the miners, right? Those are the ones that actually order transactions in a block. So if you have a block with the block header and the list of transactions, then the miners will decide what is the order here on the different transactions. So now the question is, how much liquidations happened? So how much miner extractable value was actually extractable from liquidations alone? So if you look at the last 2 years of blockchain data, covering the biggest lending platforms on Ethereum, you can see that these are actually quite substantial numbers. So this is the accumulative amount. These are the accumulative amounts that we measure, for example, on Compound here. And this is ending, I think, end of April 2021. So we haven't considered those that actually happened this week, which were also substantial, as you might have guessed, due to the recent price decline. So whenever there's a price decline, there's a surge in liquidations, and this means there's a surge in miner extractable value that miners can extract from liquidations alone. So as I said, liquidations is not the only MEV source. There might be arbitrage and many other examples. For the full details and the different MEV sources, I can recommend you checking out our paper, Quantifying Blockchain Extractable Value. We explain all the metrics and assumptions that we do to get those numbers. And I realized that these numbers may not always as big or flashy as, for example, those reported by Flashbots. So I can also recommend you to check out the MEV Explorer dashboard and just look for yourself, which data and which metrics do you think are reasonable. Some may introduce more false positives than others. So it's really great that all this data here is open source for you to inspect. So next topic, what about sandwich attacks? So sandwich attacks is another source of MEV. And to give you a bit of a background on what sandwich attacks are, we have to discuss front running. So front running is actually a decade-long issue in traditional finance. And I like to basically learn from the mistakes and the pitfalls that others have tried before. So if you look, for example, at the definition of the SEC, you can find that the SEC says front running is basically when traders are not allowed to act on non-public information to trade ahead of customers lacking that knowledge. So what's interesting is here they highlight this is non-public information, right? So you basically have to act on this non-public information ahead of others, and So if you think this is here the execution or the order execution of transactions, right? You might want to basically jump in here because you know that there was a big trade, right? Now on public and permissionless blockchains, everything is public, right? So where does front running come into play? So if you have a peer-to-peer network, right, where nodes are connected through whatever, some gossip protocol or something, and let's say this node creates a transaction, which then propagates here in this network. So at this point in time, this node, right, will receive information about this green transaction before, for example, this node here, right? So is this non-public information? Probably not, right? But still, this node here can front run the purple node, right, in emitting a transaction attempting to execute earlier than this green transaction ultimately on the blockchain. So we have this discrepancy between what will be executed and what is going to be executed. So, and this is exactly what sandwich attacks take advantage of. So here on the x-axis, you have the time appearance on the blockchain network. So it's the time axis. We have here a block n, and we have here a block n plus k. So we assume here that this is the transaction order, right? As you can see here. So there's an incoming transaction of a victim, and this transaction of the victim, for example, performs a transaction on Uniswap or any other AMM. So where it transacts an asset X for an asset Y. So this is pending because it's not yet executed on chain, right? So it's propagating on the peer-to-peer layer, or as people say, it's currently in the mempool, memory pool, the pool of unconfirmed transactions. Now, an adversary observes this particular transaction and decides to perform a sandwich. So you can see here the adversary creates two transactions. So the first one that goes in front of the victim transaction, and the second one that goes behind the victim transaction. So effectively you have here TA and TA1 and TA2 sandwiching the victim TV. Therefore the name sandwich attack. So it's not something we invented. This was actually proposed by the community actually a few years back already. So how can you avoid sandwich attacks? So if you look at the Uniswap UI and you click on this little settings icon, then you will see that you can set a slippage tolerance. So if you set this slippage tolerance quite tightly meaning, for example, 0.1% of the trade volume, then it's less likely that an adversary will perform the sandwich, because the adversary can't extract much value from your particular transaction. However, if the slippage tolerance is, let's say, larger than 0.1, whatever, 1, 2%, 3%, then an adversary will be more incentivized to perform a sandwich attack in order to extract your slippage tolerance that you set here in the for example, Uniswap UI. So the cool thing about AMMs is that we can basically quantify the attacker's profitability. So here I have it's a bit of a complicated plot. Don't worry too much about all the lines. I will just break it down for you. So the x-axis here is the ether transacted by the victim. So think of it, for example, if you have a victim that performs a 10 ether trade, and this is actually the ETH DAI market at a given point in the past on Uniswap. So if we have a 10 ether victim transaction, then we're here on this line, on this particular line here. And then the adversary will come about and we'll try to understand, can I sandwich this particular transaction? Now this depends on how much slippage you set. So let's say you were a bit lax and you were like, all right, I will just try my luck and I will put a 1% unexpected slippage parameter. So then we're here at this particular point in the chart, and this means that the adversary would actually need to perform a sandwich with at least 22.5 ether in order to perform a sandwich. However, you can see here that we are in a reddish or rose zone. This means that the revenue of the adversary is actually negative, right? So here, this is the red part. So this means for this particular setting, an adversary can actually not profitably sandwich you, which is great, right? So you can, and this is actually something that a Uniswap UI could actually visualize for users as well. And depending on the size of the trade, are you susceptible to sandwich attacks or not? And how likely you would be, and how much an adversary could potentially extract. So this can all be quantified quite beautifully with DeFi's transparency. So for the full details, again, I would like to refer you to our high frequency trading paper, which really explains the gist of this in more detail. So let's jump to another more general capabilities for front running. So this is the automated extraction of profitable transaction, or also called generalized front running bots. So front running is we've just discussed earlier. Basically, it's where a potential victim transaction is being broadcasted in a peer-to-peer network. The adversary listens to the peer-to-peer network, has probably a lot of connections there to receive information early on. Then the adversary constructs and replays a transaction, this particular victim transaction, and he executes locally the particular transaction to check whether it's profitable. I'm sure Sam will laugh a bit here, because he knows that executing locally doesn't always mean that this is the actual state that will be executed later on. And there's some funny anecdotes that we can see on Twitter for sure, and share later as well. But basically, if you execute locally, you kind of emulated what should happen when you execute it. And then then the adversary can perform a front running attempt to front run this particular victim transaction by sending data, sending the particular transaction faster to the miners, or paying a higher gas price to get prioritized. So we in one of our papers, we basically proposed such an algorithm. The idea is very simple. I mean, this is a really naive algorithm where you basically just replace the sender with your adversarial transaction, and in the input you search whether there's the sender address, and you just replace it as well with your adversarial transaction. So you do two replacements, and this is a fairly naive transaction replay algorithm. Yet by just replaying past blockchain data, right, which you can do by having an archive node, we found that the accumulative profit here over not exactly 2 years, maybe a year and a half, amounts to about 50,000 ether. And there's also a difference whether you replay on the top of the block or just ahead of the victim, of where the victim was mined. So this is just to show you an example of a generalized front running algorithm, and how much revenue this could have made given past blockchain data. Obviously, these are idealized numbers, because in reality, there's still like a lot of uncertainty with the peer-to-peer network and the execution order, etc., especially nowadays for the competitive real-time trading. So last and finally, I wanted to give a small note on BEV relayer, or also known as centralized front running as a service. Some call them theft as a service. So the basic idea is that you have a group of traders. So these are called the searchers. They're trying to identify profitable transactions on blockchains, such as arbitrage, liquidation, sandwich, and others. And they create so-called bundles, which they send to a BEV relayer. So BEV relayer is a blockchain extractable value relayer, which is a centralized server that collects these transactions. These transactions are then forwarded to the miners. The miners run a dedicated GEF client, which receives those BEV transactions. And the GEF client locally for the miner then selects the most profitable transactions in the first position and mines it in the first position. So parts of the revenue of these transactions is paid to the miners and parts goes to the searchers to incentivize both parties to actually play this game. So this BEV relayer here is a centralized server. So this may mitigate DNS service attacks, but you should know that this server has basically full visibility of the profit generating transactions. You can censor and reorder transactions unless there's some additional cryptography or trusted execution environments used. So some of the concerns that were raised in the community are the following with these blockchain extracted with a relayer. So BEV actually provably incentivizes miners to fork the chain. We have shown this on the just-in-time discovery of profitable transactions paper at S&P, which means if there's a BEV opportunity, like a liquidation event, miners that are knowledgeable about how to fork the chain efficiently and optimally, they will do so, right? It's just a rational behavior to do so. Forks in a chain will deteriorate the blockchain security, which is dangerous as it introduces double spending opportunities. One other issue is that BEV relays basically centralize the peer-to-peer network, right? You have the central server that collects all this data and through which many of the high-value transactions are funneled. Whereas we all work in the space, I believe, to decentralize the blockchains rather than centralize it. A BEV relayer may also resell or profit from searcher strategies themselves. So it's quite unclear whether these strategies are being sold or how they're being used. And there's a claim that these BEV relayers reduce the transaction fees on Ethereum. I'm not too sure that's actually the case. I have not found any conclusive evidence that shows. And I feel that there's still the incentive to actually propagate transactions on the peer-to-peer network, in addition to using a BEV relayer for searchers. And finally, I think the most critical part is probably that there's a for-profit company that distributes a GEF, like a modified GEF client, to over 50% of the miners. So like the development process in the blockchain as well as in Bitcoin, by the way, is always a critical decentralization cornerstone, right? So if this is being centralized somewhat, it can endanger the chain quite significantly, and this is something I would be cautious with. So I feel free to jump to this miners front running as a services theft article on CoinDesk. I think this has been beautifully written, and I couldn't have explained it better. It will give you more insights here as well. So thank you very much for your attention, and happy to jump into the panel discussion.
Great, yeah, thanks a lot, Sam and Arthur, for the great presentation. It's really rich with the information and shows great overview for the different types of security issues and some potential countermeasures. Yeah, thank you so much. So now we open up for the panel Q&A session. So first, I will start the Q&A. So we always start with the same question that we ask for our speakers and panelists. Given that the class also focuses on open research challenges in the DeFi space in general. So the first question is, what do you think? What are the top 3 most important open challenges in this area? So in this case, the security issues and countermeasures. For both Arthur and Sam.
It's a good question. Yeah. Sam, maybe you have some idea.
Yeah, I mean, that is really a good question. I think maybe this isn't necessarily like a problem we don't know how to solve, but something that we're having a lot of trouble with is just developer awareness of like some very conceptually well understood vulnerabilities. Like, we talked about Oracle manipulation, and that's something that, we saw last year, and unfortunately we're still seeing to this day. And so just like better education for developers to know, so they can spot these vulnerabilities before it makes it on chain and the attackers spot them instead.
Right.
Okay, so here you are talking about the better education for developers. Okay.
Right. It
Thanks.
certainly makes sense. There's a lot of I mean, obvious things for security researchers that are being done in practice, and often, I think it often has to do with the implicit nature of Solidity itself, where things are not necessarily always explicit, and then people kind of don't realize. I mean, this happens to me as well. So it's really sometimes a bit tricky to write secure smart contracts. Yeah, something I noticed in Sam's slides, which I really liked, is this insight that it's actually beneficial to pause a smart contract to secure user assets. So I feel like this is a bit how to say, there's a tension between you don't want to have a pause button or freeze button because you want a decentralized protocol. On the other hand, you want a secure protocol where you can act if there's an issue, which is obviously hard to foresee upfront. So like this tension is interesting because it touches on regulations, it touches on decentralization and security. So how can you make sure that you make everybody happy? Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah, definitely.
great. Okay, great. Yeah, thanks.
Oh, yeah.
Right. Right. So the trade-off of how much control you have. Right. It's a good question. And so another right. Some follow-up questions. So after you mentioned, right, some of the security issues are also due to language design. Some are specific to, for example, the Solidity and so on. So there also have been other efforts, for example, with the language move, and there are some other proposals for smart contract languages that have better security features and also formal verification guarantees and so on. So could you comment on that?
It's a good question. I haven't looked myself too much into formal verification of smart contracts. Yeah, I mean, I've worked on some tools that are able to find whether a certain pattern is present in a smart contract, like a reentrancy pattern. So there are certain tools available out there, but I'm sure Sam has a bit more exposure to this.
Yeah. So right now there's like, if you want formal verification, you either go to Certora or I think there's another one, but I'm forgetting the name now. I think the problem is that even with formal verification, you still have to define what you're trying to verify. And sometimes that's the hardest part, is like, what exactly is the property I'm trying to test? And if you can't come up with that, you can formally verify all the things you want, and you'll still miss the one thing that matters.
Right. Yeah, that's a very good point. Oftentimes, right, the security property specification itself is just as important as the verification itself. Okay, so we have a couple of questions. So Christine has a question. Christine, do you want to ask your question?
Sure. So in legacy financial markets, we think that people will be nervous if they're felt that they're being taken advantage of. And so the solution is to regulate. Is there a problem that has to be regulated in DeFi?
Yeah, not sure. I mean, Sam, you can also go ahead if you like.
Yeah. So I think the one big problem is like the ethos of DeFi is like no regulation. So whenever you say the R word, people sort of like bristle up and they're like, no, no, we don't need that here. I think, from a security perspective, one thing that, a topic that's often brought up is like, how responsible should auditors be for the work they do? Should there be skin in the game, or should they, be held accountable? Should there be some like regulatory agency for like, you know, the quality of auditors or whatever? It's still very much an open question that I don't think there's been any good proposals, but there's been a lot of discussion on this.
Just as a quick follow-up, so in the legacy system, skin in the game and all this comes about because I think that you might be a bad person and steal money. So I want to make sure that I essentially correctly incentivize you to do well. But it seems with all this sort of this adversarial code that you've been talking about, the issue is not whether or not it's essentially somebody is boundedly rational or they've made a mistake. And the problem is actually coming from outside their the application that they've come up with. So to some extent, the incentive problem is very, very different.
Yeah, for sure. And in the context of auditing again, the common talking point is like, auditors. So for context, the way that the security ecosystem is sort of shaped up is like you write your protocol, and then before you launch it, you go contact one of these like 8 or 9 different companies that perform auditing services. And what they'll do is they'll take your code, they'll like be in touch with you for a period of like 2+ weeks, review your code, look for bugs, and then when they're done, hopefully you have like a more secure protocol than you did 2 weeks ago. But the common talking point is like, well, sometimes like every time a protocol has been hacked, it's been audited most likely. So like, should auditors have skin in the game? Like, should they be forced to pay a portion of the audit feedback, or like, should they be forced to compensate for damages, sort of stuff like that? But yeah, just some context to what the discussion is about.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of bug bounties in general, and it seems like the being paid by the hour for smart contracts security audits doesn't really align the incentives between the auditor and the DeFi project itself, right? So this is quite an interesting question to investigate. Yeah.
Right, thanks. So as a follow-up question, so one topic that we didn't get to cover in the class is insurance. So for example, there have been various decentralized solutions for providing insurance for these smart contracts and so on. And right, so could you to comment on that? What your thoughts are and how you think that can help address some of these security issues?
Yeah, I haven't looked myself into insurances, to be honest. But the problem I see with insurance is you always need a third party that in the end judges whether there's a case or there's a claim or not, right? And here you need a trusted oracle. So doing this in a decentralized way is probably quite tricky. But yeah, I wouldn't want to say anything wrong because I haven't looked into it much further myself.
Yeah, I'll add that, although my experience is definitely not in insurance either, I can comment that right now I think there's at least 1 or 2 insurance protocols out there. There's like Nexus Mutual, which is like the original. There's currently Armor Finance, which is like another one. And the way these work is you can buy claims in like a decentralized fashion, but ultimately if you want to you can buy cover, but if you want to make a claim, that does go through a centralized body, and you have to hope that the terms that they made are favorable to you. There was famously, again with the BZX hacks, I think the first hack they didn't pay out any insurance on that because it was considered like market manipulation, something like that. And they had some really fine wording around like, yeah, we'll pay out for smart contract vulnerabilities, but not market manipulation or something like that.
Mhm. Right. Yeah, great. Yeah, thank you. Right, I think there are a couple other questions in chat. Right. Also, can you speak to some of the challenges you alluded to around the generalized front runners?
Yeah, of course. So generous front runner is just basically an algorithm that tries to replay any transaction that you receive on the network layer, right? You can parallelize this very easily with many cores. So the challenge is how to protect against this. I think there actually quite some cool blog posts from Paradigm about this, on how to avoid being front run by generalist front runners. So let's say Sam tomorrow finds a new bug in a smart contract as he does, and he wants to save the user funds. How can he do this in a secure way, by avoiding that front runners will actually scoop up all those user funds, right? I think this is really a challenge where which you can solve to some degree if you have a private agreement with miner and you send this miner your transaction and you hope that this miner will not broadcast or share this transaction with anyone else before it's being mined at the particular order that you request.
Yeah, I'll just add on. This is something that before the rise of the BEV protocols, this is a very big challenge. Was how do you get these transactions out there and without an attacker seeing? Because by definition, if you find a bug in a protocol, it's a public vulnerability that anyone with the right transaction data can also exploit. I just wanted to mention real quick, just like some ways that we did protect against these generalized front runners. And so I guess these would be challenges for the front runners themselves because we were using it to bypass them. But one really common approach was because you can, on Ethereum, transactions are ordered by the transaction nonce, which is like incrementing number. What you can do is you can send two transactions to two different contracts, which when executed sequentially will unlock some behavior, but when simulated locally one at a time, not unlock that behavior. And so through that, you can hope to trick these generalized front runners that only simulate one transaction. Of course, they can then apply techniques like simulating pairs of two transactions, and then it's just a cat and mouse game.
You're muted.
I think you're muted.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Can you hear me now? Right. I must have been. Oh, you can hear me now, right?
Yes.
Okay, great. So right, and also students are interested in knowing are there good resources for learning and developing secure smart contracts?
Yeah, I have a blockchain course online on YouTube that helps you to some degree on that. I also developed the blockchainworkbench.com that introduces basically an open source platform for interactive IDE for learning smart contract solidity programming. I guess it's a good first step. I think there's actually another IDE or open source, I mean a web-based tool from, I don't remember exactly the name. It was I think from a layer 2 project. Maybe Sam remembers.
I'm sorry, I don't know which one you're referring to. I think
Crypto Zombies, I think. Crypto Zombies.
Oh yeah.
Right. Yeah, no, I remember. I think Crypto Zombies is quite fun as well. So I guess these are good. Yeah, here's the link. These are good tools to kind of get the hang of Solidity. And as far as I know, they also have some security aspects. I mean, they basically show some of the pitfalls that you should avoid, like properly put modifiers everywhere, and how to avoid reentrancy, etc. Yeah.
Great. So maybe one final question from the students. Is there some discussions on how to resolve losses due to attacks? For example, holding developers accountable completely might thwart incentives to innovate, while some sort of insurance to losses is also desirable to users. And also, I think we have seen, plenty of online, discussions where when there are attacks, right, sometimes the developers get blamed. Right, I think this actually happened to like developer of year and so on. So yes, it'll be great to have you guys comment on this.
So in the past, again, EZX really set, a lot of milestones for being the first to all of these by virtue of getting hacked so many times. But their approach to this was to basically like socialize the loss. They said, our protocol is now underwater for like $1 million or something. So we will just use, I think they said they'll use the like protocol fees, just they'll like treat it as just debt, and they'll like pay it back slowly using protocol fees or something. And so like technically all the users are made whole. So there was like some weird arrangement they did to like tweak the numbers, make it work out. More recently, I forgot the name of the protocol. I mean, I think the point I'm trying to make is in general, like protocols have gotten really good at sort of taking the loss and ensuring that it's either not realized or spread out fairly across the users, so everyone takes like a small haircut. You don't really get like, oh sorry, we got hacked, a portion of people are just wrecked anymore.
Yeah, thanks. Arthur, do you have some comments to add?
Yeah, I mean, I like to take the stand sometimes that code is the law. I know this doesn't make everybody happy all the time, and it's dangerous. It's good to be able to resolve disputes somewhat afterwards, but I am working in this space because I love decentralization and permissionlessness. So I hope we can basically make everyone happy without compromising those properties.
Great. Yeah, thanks everyone. Right. Again, let's thank our great guest speakers for such a wonderful lecture. And again, it's really informative, and the security is a really important topic. And I think everyone has learned a lot. And also, I want to thank everyone for. So Christine and I, I want to thank everyone for a wonderful class. This is the last lecture, and yeah, thanks everyone for joining. And also, so Arthur and me and a couple others also organizing a workshop on DeFi together with the top security conference, ACM CCS. And for people who are interested, Arthur send out the link in the chat. So yeah, welcome to participate and to submit and so on. Right, great. Yes, let's thank our speakers and thanks everyone.
Thank you very much. It was really good.
Thanks a lot, Don. Thanks, Christine. Thanks, Sam. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for having me.
Right, and also we'll make the class videos available on the website for students who may have missed some of the lectures. Great. Thanks, everyone. Right, thank you.